Hello and welcome back to Neo-Psychology with me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach psychology lessons to my wonderful students. Today we're carrying on with research methods and we're looking at lesson 20, observational design evaluation. It's a short one. We're just going to evaluate the different observational designs that we looked at last lesson, see what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses. Let's have a look. Okay, starter. Have you ever sat and observed someone's behavior? Last lesson we had a look at the ways in which one would be able to design an observational study and how to measure behavior. But each observational method comes with both strengths and weaknesses. So we had a look at structured versus unstructured. Unstructured, we just write everything down, every single thing that you see, and you write everything down that everyone's doing. Structured is more like you're going to create some behavioral categories about the specific behaviors that you want to observe, and then tick them as and when you see them with event sampling or every point with time sampling. And we're going to have a look at some of those evaluative points today. Let's have a look. Structured versus unstructured we're going to discuss and evaluate, as well as behavioral categories and then the different sampling methods there are. Okay. Last lesson, we looked at ways of observing an observation. There are strengths and weaknesses for each method of designing an observation. Let's have a look at structured versus unstructured first of all. Structured observations that involve the use of behavioral categories make the recording of data easier. This is a strength, and more systematic. The data produced is likely to be numerical, which is qualitative data, which means that analyzing and comparing the behavior observed between participants is more straightforward. However, it may lack detail. So a strength of structured observations is that you usually have your behavioral categories and it's quite easy. It's an easy thing to do just to tick them off when you see the behavior. There we go, it's in that category that I'm looking for. I know what I'm looking for and I found it. However, with this, it is straightforward, but it may lack detail. It may not get some of the important details about the behavior that you're observing that you may need, that may make the difference. In contrast, however, unstructured observations tend to produce qualitative data, which may be much more difficult to record and analyze. Quantitative data is with numbers because it's got an L. Qualitative data is with an L because it's about literature, it's about words. So qualitative data would be with an unstructured observation where I'm literally just writing every single thing that I'm seeing now. Okay, so our student is writing, that person is talking, this one's on their phone. I'm writing all like that rather than a structured observation where I've got the categories and I'm putting numbers, I'm tallying. However, unstructured observations benefit from more richness and depth of detail in the data collected. It's a lot more detail. I've got so many more details. So for example, in an interview is an example of qualitative data, and I might write down everything I see in that interview and everything they talk about, and I'm going to have loads and loads of detail about a really small amount of people, maybe one or two people I might be interviewing, and I've got loads of detail. So it's high in detail. Depth of detail is good, and that is a strength. Okay, so we had a look at one strength and one weakness of each of structured and unstructured observations. Identify one thing you just learned about structured versus unstructured observations, evaluation. Why do you think learning about structured versus unstructured evaluation is important? And how does it apply in real life? If you have any further questions, let me know, write them down, and I'll be happy to answer them. And that's structured versus unstructured observations. Tick. Let's move on to the second learning objective. It's going to be a short one today. Discuss and evaluate behavioral categories. Although the use of behavioral categories can make data collection more structured and objective, it is important that such categories are clear and unambiguous as possible. Unambiguous meaning clear. Ambiguous meaning it's not very clear, we're not really sure what's going on. They must be observable, they must be measurable, and self-evident. So it must be obvious to the person that's recording the data. In other words, they should not require further interpretation. So one good thing about behavioral categories is that you can create your behavioral categories to be clear, observable, and measurable. However, researchers should also ensure that all possible forms of target behavior are included in the checklist, okay? So all of the behaviors you want to observe or you're assuming may come up, they need to be in your checklist. There should not be a dustbin category in which many different behaviors are deposited. So I've got, happiness, sadness, whatever, and I've got a miscellaneous one where it's just anything. And then lots of things happen that I didn't think would come up. So I go, that's in the miscellaneous one. That's in the dustbin category. Yep. And I've got a massive list of loads of dustbin categories. I go, well, that data isn't being interpreted very well. Finally, categories should be exclusive and not overlap. For instance, the difference between smiling and grinning would be very difficult to discern or to distinguish, okay? So it needs to be really clear. Your categories can't lap over. Again, so that's behavioral categories evaluation, a few strengths and a few weaknesses. Identify one thing you learned about behavioral categories. Why do you think it's important and how does it apply in real life? Again, what questions has behavioral categories evaluation raised for you? What are you still wondering about? I want to know. If you don't want to ask me, ask someone else in class. Why not? I'm sure they know. They're all smart. Sort of. And that's to discuss and evaluate behavioral categories. Done. Yes, well done. And we're riding through this. We're on to learning objective 3 to discuss and evaluate the different sampling methods. Here we go. Sampling methods evaluation. Event sampling is useful. So event sampling when you literally tally every time that event occurs. Event sampling is useful when the target behavior or event happens quite infrequently and could be missed if time sampling was used. Okay, so it's helpful because in time sampling, if you're recording every minute or every 30 seconds or even every 5 minutes, in between those gaps where you're not sampling or you're not observing behavior, you might miss loads and loads of details that might be there. The positives, well, we're going to have a look at the positives, but the positives of time sampling is that it's quite easy to do and you can get a large bit of information. If I was observing a behavior of, say, a baby over like a 24-hour period and they recorded them for 24 hours, if I did an unstructured observation, I'd have to sit there all day writing every single thing that happens. If I do a time sampling one, or even event sampling, there might be loads of times they do a certain thing. I've got massive tallies going on, but with time sampling, I might want to reduce my time. I've got better things to do. So I might go, right, I'm going to record what the baby's doing on the hour every hour. And then I've got 24 hours piece of information. Okay, on this hour they were eating, in this hour they were just sitting around doing nothing, and then I'll do it that way. So it's quite an easy way of doing it. Event sampling is useful when the target behavior or event happens quite infrequently and could be missed if the time sampling was used. However, if the specific event is too complex, the observer may overlook important details if using event sampling. Time sampling, though, is effective in reducing the number of observations that have been made, making it simpler to record. So it's a simpler way of doing things, okay? Especially if you had a large piece of data that you had to observe and you had to analyze and essentially put into your behavioral categories, then it would be a lot easier and simpler to do that. However, that said, those instances where behavior is sampled might be unrepresentative of the observation as a whole. I might miss some really important behaviors within those timeframes where I'm not sampling their behavior. Question. Spend 5 minutes on this. It's 3 marks, so you get around 5 minutes in the exam. Explain the difference between event sampling and time sampling. How would you answer this question? Well, you would give a definition of event sampling and give a definition of time sampling. If you want to ensure to get those 3 marks each, maybe give an example of event sampling and time sampling to ensure you're covering all the marks possible. Explain the difference between event sampling and time sampling. Pause the video, write your answer down now, please. I want to see it in your notes. Let's have a look at the answer. Stop cheating. I said pause it. Event sampling involves keeping account of the number of times a certain behavior or event occurs, whereas time sampling involves recording those behaviors in some given time frame, for example, such as every 15 seconds. And that's sampling methods evaluation. We had a look at some of the strengths of time sampling and event sampling, and some of the weaknesses of both of those sampling techniques as well. Identify one thing you learned about the sampling methods evaluation. Why do you think it's important? And how does this apply in real life? Again, what questions has sampling methods evaluation raised for you? Or what are you still wondering about? I want to hear your questions. I like your questions. They're usually decent. There we go. We've done learning objective 3 already. Plenary. What is in the plenary? Some multiple choice questions. Yes, lovely. Our favourite. Anyway, number 1. Which is not a way of sampling behaviour in an observation? Is it A, continuous recording, B, time sampling, C, event sampling, D, stratified sampling? Which is not a way of sampling behaviour in an observation. What do you think? Did you say D? You're right, well done. It is stratified sampling. That's a sampling technique to get participants, not a sampling technique for observation. Number 2, yes. To improve observations, pairs of researchers must establish what? A, inter-researcher validity, B, extrasensory perception, C, inter-observer reliability, or D, observer bias? What must be established? Did you say C? You did. You're lying. But you're right. It is C, inter-observer reliability. Good. Number 3. Which would not be associated with an affective behavioural category? A, ambiguity, B, measurability, C, observable, or D, self-evident? We had a look at those just a second ago. Which one? Ambiguity. Yes, you're right. Which is a term, number 4, which is a term which describes an ineffective behavioural category? Is it A, dustbin, B, bin bag, C, dust cart, or D, bin liner? C, dust cart. You're wrong. It's A, dustbin. It's a dustbin category, it's called. How well did you do? How many questions did you get correct out of 4? Did you get 4 out of 4? Are you an absolute legend? Maybe you are. Maybe you're not. Oh, you're all legends to me. I love you all. Okay, and that's the end of the lesson. Thank you for joining today's lesson. It was an incredibly short one, but we had a look at the strengths and weaknesses of observational designs. So today was lesson 20, observational design evaluation. Be sure to write up your notes for next lesson. Well done, my neo-psychologists. Keep up the brilliant work. I've been Mr. Neo. God bless. Next lesson we'll learn about lesson 21, self-report techniques. Peace.
I'm feeling like Will. I feel like a prince. I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels. I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip. My life is a flick, now load up the film.